Good evening again. We're going to get started, and John has no problem if you continue to eat and drink your coffee. Now, I know you're going to say, but there is no coffee. And so I just realized that, so we're going to ask for coffee. And thank you for your patience with us. There are these orange sheets at your tables, and the links on those sheets relate to work that is being done by the got to get the name right, the World Mission and Social Justice Council here at Fourth Presbyterian. And these are resources for violence and taking action. And so if you're interested, please take this home and check out the links. And then one other thing I wanted to mention is that Sunday, the World Mission Council will be sponsoring a table from the Firehouse Community Arts Center, whose mission is to interrupt the cycle of violence among youth and young adults in North Lawndale through the power of the arts and faith. So representatives of the Arts Center will be at coffee hour on Sunday. So if you're here, please stop by and check out the information about the center. So now it's time to move on to our speaker. I just want to mention one thing that is not in his bio, and that is that in August of 2024, the magazine Modern Healthcare recognized Dr. Rich as a top leader in healthcare diversity. The award acknowledges that deep divides continue to exist in patient healthcare outcomes and in access to patient care. The award is given to recognize those who are working to address those disparities. So with that, I'm sure you're all looking forward to hearing from Dr. Rich, and I will turn the floor over to him.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for that introduction. I'll never forget the day that I was walking through the hallway at Boston City Hospital. I was a new doctor in 1990, and I had done my medical training across town at Massachusetts General Hospital, which is one of those gleaming institutions at Harvard that attracts people from all over the world, both as providers and as patients. But when I looked around to think about where I wanted to work, I found myself across town at Boston City Hospital, the municipal hospital for the city. And while as a physical structure, that's more or less how it looked, it was a place that was taking care of anyone who needed care, regardless of whether they had insurance or not. And Boston City Hospital served the areas of Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan, largely Black and Hispanic people historically in a rather segregated city. I went there in 1990, and as some of you remember, in 1990, we were in the midst of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. In 1990, we had no drugs to treat HIV. And so I began in the HIV clinic there, really comforting, using what we could to chase the infections that would ultimately cost people their lives. At the same time, in Boston in 1990, Boston set a record for the number of homicides. Fueled by the crack epidemic, Boston had 150 homicides that year, which I think in the past year, Boston's had less than 20. So it was in that context that I began as a new primary care doctor And I was walking through the hall one day and I ran into a colleague of mine, Dr. Jonathan Woodson, a vascular surgeon and trauma surgeon who had also trained at Mass General Hospital and had also come to Boston City Hospital. And he was clearly upset because he said, there was a young man who came in as a gunshot victim, a gunshot wound to the chest, about 3 weeks ago. And we rushed him to the operating room and we were able to save his life. Even though the bullet had passed within an inch of his aorta, we were able to get him back, resuscitate him, and get him out of the hospital. But he said, yesterday morning I was on my way in and I heard that that same young man had been shot again and that he was dead. So he said, we have to do something. We have these young people who come in, they've been victims of violence, they're in the hospital for sometimes weeks. We have to do something. We have to talk with them. We have to figure out how to get in front of this terrible pandemic. And so I began to try and better understand this. And I was really a novice, but I had learned from some other colleagues of mine a method of research called qualitative research, where I would do interviews and analyze the interviews. So I began talking to young people who came in as victims of violence. But I also began to think about my own experience in the hospital as I walked around, because I saw lots of young men, and young men, of course, are more likely than other groups, particularly young men of color, to be victims of homicide and firearm violence. But my primary care clinic didn't have very many of these young people in it. Rather, orthopedic clinic, sexually transmitted disease clinic, the surgical wards, the emergency department. So these were young people who didn't have, for whatever reason, access to health care. So I began to talk with these young people and began to talk with my other colleagues. And I began to realize that at some level, all of the providers in this hospital had this mental model. They had an idea in their heads. And this was the idea. Young black men don't just get shot, they get themselves shot. Right? It was almost always, you could come in as a victim of violence, but our poise toward you was, to some extent, you brought this on yourself. And so almost any story that you would tell could be interpreted as, oh, you brought this on yourself. So what time did you get shot? It was 1 a.m. Oh, so you're on your way to work, right? So, the sarcasm there. And so I was troubled because here were young people, anyone who comes into an emergency department, a hospital, with an injury ought not be treated as though they're to blame. But of course, that many times victims of sexual violence are treated in similar ways. So I was troubled, but the more that I examined myself, the more I realized that perhaps I held some of those same biases. And so I began to try and understand this. I opened a clinic called the Young Men's Health Clinic at Boston City Hospital, the goal of which was to create a place that young people could come and get primary care to prevent some of their health problems and to treat the aftermath of their injuries. What I've learned, though, and I found was, and this will be what I will talk about today, I learned how much trauma these young people had in their lives and how trauma was driving the cycle of violence. So, let's take a step back. We believe that everyone should have the chance to be healthy. We also believe that everyone should have the chance to be safe. All of us need that. We not only need it for our well-being, we need it for the health of our bodies. So I'm going to warn you that in a moment you're going to hear a sound. Okay? Just imagine you're walking down the street. You're on your way home. You've had a good day. You're listening to music maybe through your earbuds, or you're just thinking about what you're going to do for dinner. And you approach a familiar yard, and suddenly out of nowhere, a dog is rushing at you. All you can see is through the side of your eye. Something's rushing at you. You hear the barking. All you see is this coming at you. What happens to you in your body? Anyone? Okay. Definitely the adrenaline flows, but what does it feel like?
Flight.
Like flight, like it makes you want to run, flight? Okay. Anything else you feel in your body?
Tense up.
Tense up, absolutely. What else?
Stress.
Say again?
Stress.
You feel stress? Any other things your body starts to do? In addition?
Fear.
Fear, okay. Good. Anybody sweat? Right. Anybody get the hair stand up on the back of your hair? Your heart starts to beat rapidly. Right. What else? Anything that you notice?
Maybe feel defensive.
Yeah, so right, you might actually posture yourself to shield yourself. Do you get to think about that first, or does it happen automatically? Right, so beautiful. All of these things that happen are a part of the normal stress response. When you are faced with this kind of threat, your body reacts. Your pupils contract. The way you lay down memory changes. It changes from words to almost images, almost like a movie's being filmed. Your body stops digesting food and sends all the blood from your intestines to your arms and legs because you're going to have to run. You not only put out adrenaline, which makes your heart beat fast and you start to breathe faster, but you pour out cortisol. Cortisol stops insulin from working. Now, the reason that's important is when you're going to fight or flee, you need lots of energy, glucose, right? So all of this is happening in the instant. So let's say you realize, wait a minute, that dog is behind a fence, on a chain, on a strong chain, and it's actually not that big a dog, and it looks kind of like a friendly dog. How long does it take for that to go back to normal?
An hour?
So an hour, potentially. I hear some people say minutes. Some people say seconds. But it's not days, right? This is a system that's so elegant. It is on when you need it, and it's off when you don't. And it forms the basis of how we keep ourselves healthy and safe. So the basis of this is stress, and we define stress as the set of changes in the body and the brain that are set into motion when there are overwhelming threats to physical or psychological well-being. And we often talk about different types of stress. So not all stress is bad. Positive stress. So this is, you're preparing for the big game. You're preparing for a concert recital. You're going to run a road race. You've got a big exam. So it's stressful, but it's developmental. It's short-lived, and you're better at the other side of it, right? And then there's what we might call tolerable stress. And that is something that might be the loss of a job, potentially an illness in the family, financial difficulties. Hopefully they're more intense, but again, have a potential resolution. And if you have support, you're likely to get through it without much problem. Increasingly, though, now we're talking about toxic stress. Toxic stress often manifest as early childhood adversity or abuse or neglect, that particularly for children, if it affects the major developmental parts when your brain is in its maximum development, can actually cause really developmental changes in the brain. Now, those changes can themselves be reversed, but it shifts the brain's development away from, for example, reading and comprehension and art over to survival. And there are different parts of the brain that are responsible for that. So finally, we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. And I know that you've heard of this along the way, but just to review, there are 4 components now to our way of diagnosing PTSD. The first is hyperarousal or hyperreactivity. That usually manifests as inability to sleep, jumpiness, so a fright response. You've heard, so if someone's been deployed to war and they come back and somebody slams a car door, they'll experience that and jump. So that's one of the components. Re-experiencing or intrusive symptoms, that's nightmares, flashbacks, or body memories. So where you feel pain in a particular part of your body when you're reminded of the event that happened. You go back, emotional numbing and avoidance, that's where you lose the ability to actually feel emotions. And then that's overwritten, but difficulty concentrating and depression, those all come together. Now, what's happening in the brain when you have PTSD? And I promise this is the last physiology slide that I'll show you. Well, this slide is a kind of animation that shows you the part of the brain where you feel emotion is called the amygdala, and it's lit. You're seeing it lit up there. And it interprets stimuli that you might see as whether it's dangerous or not. And it's sometimes called the seat of emotion. It's about a walnut-size shaped structure. And as this animation shows, if you see something, it will come in through these nerves. Let's say those are your optic nerves, and it will stimulate that. Oh, it's really just showing you that there's the amygdala. This blue part is called the prefrontal cortex. That's the reasoning part of your brain. Helps you figure things out. Okay? And this little part in here is lit up as called the hypothalamus. That's where memory is. So let's say you see something. You're walking through the forest and you see something out of the corner of your eye. It looks like a snake. Well, first you get this, it hits your amygdala, it activates your body so you're sweating, but eventually that information goes around to your brain and you realize that's a stick, that's not a snake. And then the prefrontal cortex turns off all that stuff. That's what happens when the dog comes at you. If you have PTSD though, something different happens. That is, if you've got all these memories in that hypothalamus area, when you get a stimulus, it bypasses that front part of your brain and it activates the past memory. Okay? So rather than getting, oh, this is just a snake, this is just a stick, rather, for people who have had a bad experience with a snake, they're right back in that place. Right? And so this is the stress response gone awry. And it often, particularly for young people who live in urban environments where they've seen a lot of trauma, they actually experience very much the same syndrome that people returning from war zones experience. So I'd like to introduce you to a young man named David Green. David is a young man who is a survivor of violent injury. We met him in Philadelphia, where he was part of a program called Healing Hurt People, which is a hospital-based program to help survivors of violence. As part of that program, young people engage in therapy, groups, they get support to deal with to get jobs, to education, and the like. We also engage them in telling their own story through digital stories. So they get to tell the story in their own words, using the images that represent their experience. What I'd like to do is to just play this 3-minute story for you. And I would just ask that you, as you hear David talk, if there's any word or set of words or phrases that sort of jump out at you, that sort of stick, to just repeat them back. Okay? Afterwards, we call this recall. Just what stayed with you. Let's see what words kind of get inside of us that kind of give us a sense of what might be happening. Okay? We checked the volume. I think it's loud enough, but please let me know if you're having difficulty hearing.
None of the people I knew in the sandbox is alive today. I was shooting basketball with friends at the playground the first time I saw someone get shot. It was random. I didn't think something like that would happen to me or my family. I have seen a lot. Now I don't sleep at nights. Last year my cousin was killed at home in his bed. While everyone is sleeping, I stay awake. I go to sleep in the morning when people are up and moving around. When I do sleep, I have nightmares. Sometimes I wake up crying, feeling lonely, wanting revenge. I wake up paranoid. But there was something that really hurt me, even more than when I got shot 3 times. I was sitting in the street with my brother's head in my lap. Dude stood over him holding a gun before running away. Dude just left. There was nothing I could do. My brother wanted me to hold him. I was crying, panicking. He said, I'm going to be all right. Little did he know, he wasn't. After that, I knew I would get shot. I started imagining how it would be and how I would hold my body so that they wouldn't shoot me in my heart or my head. When walking in the streets, I would think about how to turn my body so that the bullet would hit my shoulders and not my heart. Or how I would use my hands and arms to shield my head. I'm always looking back over my shoulder at my own shadow, hoping that one day I would stop focusing on my past, but looking ahead to my future.
Anything?
When he said I was crying, so often we think of street people as being devoid of emotion and sympathy.
Thank you. Thank you. So crying, which, right.
Hello?
The word shot
Mm,
continually.
shot. Yes.
And the word future.
Here we go.
Future.
The word future denotes that there's some hope that he has a life ahead of him.
Yes. Future. Right here.
So he's always looking behind him and waiting. And if you're always like that, you can't learn anything. And
Yes, that kind of stress often makes it difficult to learn. This gentleman right here. actually, this end.
Well, he has a very active imagination. So he's imagining of what might happen and what his response would be.
Okay, thank you.
Also, his physical cycles were upside down. He was awake during the day and asleep,
Yes.
other way around.
Yes.
So it's got to be bad for your metabolism, if nothing else.
Yes, that's right. Awake when, right, awake during the night, but sleeping when other people are around, right?
I think you mentioned the word paranoia.
Yes,
That stood out.
yes, thank you. Down front here?
I understood that his brother died in his arms. Is that right?
That's right. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I'm haunted a little bit by his reference to looking over his shoulder, looking over his back all the time, and therefore not being able to think of the future.
Yeah,
That
thank you.
sort of sticks with me.
Thank you.
Just a little follow-up to what Cynthia said. He wanted me to hold him. Just the pain of loss.
Yes, yes. The pain of loss.
She said he wanted me to hold him. The brother said that to him when he was dying. I think.
Great, thank you. Thank you, appreciate that. So, thank you for that recall and honoring his words. So let's take a look at this through the lens of trauma and PTSD as we just talked about. So he says, none of the people I knew in the sandbox is alive today. So he traces his history of loss back to the kids he grew up with. My cousin was shot in his bed, and I don't sleep at night. So the connection between that trauma and what is a disruption in his ability to his regular sleep cycles. He says, I have nightmares, I wake up crying, feeling lonely, wanting revenge. My brother wanted me to hold him, I was crying, panicking. After that, I knew I would get shot. Well, these are experiences of trauma that he talks about, and many of us have experienced loss. Here, when does loss become trauma? Well, a noted expert, Bessel van der Kolk, says the experience of trauma is when your internal resources and your external resources are insufficient to deal with an external threat. Plain language, when the strength inside of you and the support around you is not enough to deal with the threat that's coming, that's the experience of trauma. The reason that's important is it's dynamic. What might be traumatizing to me in one point in my life when I don't have support may not be traumatizing to me in another point. But in this case, he's experiencing unusual levels of trauma. This being awake at night is in that category of what we call hyperarousal. Insomnia is a very common symptom of trauma in PTSD. Depression also is a common symptom, as well as re-experiencing. So he's having these nightmares, flashbacks, which is a waking dream. He has more trauma, and then this experience is hyperarousal. Sometimes people call it reenactment. So it is kind of an imagination, but it is an attempt by the brain to construct what may be kind of an seemingly illogical, because can you really shield yourself with your hand? But it is an adjustment, is part of what kind of phobias can develop, right? What seem like irrational fears. So I would argue that if we take a look at this through the lens of trauma, we understand it. We understand that he's not going crazy. We understand that he is like others who may need treatment. The problem is that most of the time, young people like this get no explanation about the traumatic symptoms that may come, and so they think they're going crazy. The other thing I would say about this is that, and let's come back to that, but what we do know with regard to the cycle of violence, that if we look at people who have had a penetrating injury, a stab wound or gunshot wound, and we follow them for 5 years, 44% of them have had another gunshot wound or a stab wound. And that was a study done in Chicago. At 5 years, 20% of those people are dead. But they didn't all die from violence. In 70% of the cases of those people who died, substance abuse is listed as a contributing cause on their death certificates. So we're not seeing, it's the aftermath of the trauma that we're seeing manifest often in the lives of people who have experienced unacceptable levels of violence. So how does it play out? A young person is in the hospital for a firearm injury. They may have PTSD, but they are not, it may not be diagnosed, it may not be explained to them. When they go home, they have these disturbing symptoms. It is logical and maybe even functional to find something in your environment that will ease that pain. Cannabis is a logical solution to that problem. But cannabis at low doses will help to alleviate some of those symptoms. So many times young people use it for the nightmares. But at high doses, it makes them worse. So you're using a kind of unregulated dose of something, and it would seem to make sense that if it a little bit helps, more would help more. That isn't the case. But if you don't have someone who can provide you with a prescription, then it makes sense to use what you've got. Well, if you try and get a job at Home Depot while you're using cannabis, you will be rejected. And so these young people, by self-medicating themselves, by self-medicating, are cut off from employment. And that is often what drives young people into illicit economies, because you can't get a job because you're self-treating yourself. On the other hand, if you don't feel safe, the police are not an option for many young people because they feel as though the police will consider them the cause of any problem. So if you don't feel safe, calling the police is often viewed not as an option. There's also something, and we were talking about this earlier, that you hear when you talk with young people, and that is, if I live in a hostile environment and I let people victimize me, then I just send a message to everybody else that they can victimize me too, right? And therefore, I better nip it in the bud because otherwise I'm basically making myself a permanent victim. Now, I know many of us have heard that before. It plays out in workplaces all the time. Don't let that person do that to you, or everybody will think they can do that to you. These young people didn't make that up. But when it plays out in these dangerous environments, you can sometimes see protective behaviors that seem out of proportion to the threat. Well, if you don't feel safe, you don't believe that the police will protect you, then many young people turn to weapons. That is a prescription for jail or death. Now, by offering this explanation, I am not offering an excuse. I want to make a distinction. But by understanding trauma as a foundation of these young people's behavior, rather than dehumanizing them by suggesting that they are savage or that they are senseless, we often talk about violence as senseless, and it indeed is tragic. But if we understand something about the logic and the drivers, I find myself in a more hopeful place. Because if these young people are unreasonable, then we have no option but incarceration, for example, or institutionalization. But if they're reacting to a set of circumstances in their bodies and in their environments, we can do something about that. Now, we have to hold on to the fact that structural racism is real. These young people are living many times in segregated neighborhoods that have been left devoid of supermarkets, manufacturers, places to work. They're often filled with predatory lending establishments and the like. So our colleague Zinzi Bailey defines structural racism as the totality of ways in which societies foster racial discrimination through these mutually reinforcing systems of housing, education, employment, earnings, and the like. And these patterns and practices in turn reinforce discriminatory beliefs, values, and the distribution of resources. So there's a kind of automatic blaming of people who have lack of access to these. We also now talk more about racial trauma, and our colleague Ken Hardy defines racial trauma as an inescapable byproduct of persistent exposure to repressive circumstances that emotionally, psychologically, and physically devastate one's sense of self while simultaneously depleting one's strategies for coping. It is a life-altering and debilitating experience that affects countless numbers of people of color over multiple generations. It's worth spending a moment with this because the American Psychological Society has identified racial trauma as a factor in many diseases. So the fact that people experience sort of dehumanization or are not acknowledged, that can, certainly for young people who are growing up in settings, can have an adverse effect. Now, and I've written about this in a book called Wrong Place, Wrong Time. I'm happy to share it with anyone who would like to read it. It really is the stories of young people. But this book was a labor of hope. Because when you sit and talk with young people, and I encourage you wherever you get the opportunity, and I know some of you do, you will find a disconnect between what you see on the news and the young people in front of you. The dissonance is palpable, and it will make you, or let me simply speak for myself, it made me question everything that was coming in from news and others or about who they are. And their humanity stands out. Their desire for many of the same things that we want comes out clearly. And so let me tell you in just a couple of minutes what is happening at Rush and in many places across the country, which is we are taking seriously our responsibility as healthcare providers to address the root causes of the problems that we see. And so Healing Hurt People is a hospital-based violence intervention. It is designed for people who have been exposed to gun violence. In this case at Rush, not only people who have been shot, but people who have had exposure in their communities, people who might live next door to someone who was shot, might have lived in a community for 5 years and heard and seen lots of violence. We're screening everyone who comes in for post-traumatic stress disorder. And if they're interested, if they have post-traumatic stress and they're interested, we're offering them an evidence-based treatment called cognitive processing therapy that's delivered in a unique format. Now, any of you who have been blessed enough to engage in therapy with a therapist, and I'm a fierce advocate for therapy, will know that you come back once a week for 12 weeks, maybe, or for some period of time. If your life is complicated, that's complicated. This therapy can be delivered in a compressed fashion based on what the person would like. So if you say, listen, I need treatment for my post-traumatic stress, I want 10 sessions, I'd like 2 sessions a day for 5 days. Absolutely. And what we have found is that it is as effective, and the dropout rate is almost nil. Now, most people don't select twice a day for 5 days, but they might select 3 times a week for 3 weeks. And that takes into account the fact that transportation, other factors can be really the difference maker in terms of whether you engage in therapy. And we're also addressing what we call health-related social needs at the same time. So screening for food insecurity, screening for housing insecurity, understanding whether people have other needs that are unmet. And so I just described to you screening, case management, and then these sessions. Community health workers are a key part of this. That is, people with the lived experience of violence are there also to support people getting what they need. We found that 1 in 7 people who get screened in the emergency department has probable PTSD, and people only have to wait about a week before they get the start of therapy. We're finding that PTSD, depression, anxiety symptoms all decrease by more than 50% by the end of treatment. We're also measuring what is thought about as well-being. So there's a scale that measures more than just, are you feeling bad? It measures what are the positive aspects in your life as well. And that's important so we don't see people who have been survivors of violence only as the injured. We see them more holistically. And what we're seeing is improvements in overall well-being of 25%, but also increases in positive emotion, relationships, their self-perceived health. And so we have a unique opportunity to go to the root cause, which I would argue to you is trauma. That if we can first address the pain and address the need for healing, we will have a tremendous difference in our own lives and the lives of these young people. And we're better to talk about this than a faith community, where we embrace the idea of healing, where we embrace the idea of redemption and humanity. That, to me, represents a leadership position where we can really change how people are treated. We can also change the narrative. So I've just talked about an evidence-based treatment, but there are a lot of ways to heal, many more. Faith communities, prayer, meditation, yoga, exercise, all of these are proven ways to heal. And we began an effort in Philadelphia called Our Words Heal. And it's an attempt to change the narrative about healing, about trauma, so that communities can also see within our own communities there are natural healers. There are grandmoms who have been sitting on the porch helping young people not make the bad decision that they can tell they're about to make, right? And so how do we mobilize that, and how do we tell a different story? So I'm going to finish by sharing a brief video that highlights the Our Words Heal perspective. It is a perspective that we're now replicating in Atlanta, and I'll let it stand on its own.
I can still see that vision so clearly in my head, the picture so vivid. Everything, like it's just played over and over and over. How do I go from there?
I mean, everybody's trauma is different. I've had my really, really low moments where I just feel like, what am I here for?
When you constantly think about that or you bring it up in conversations, that's you not being able to get past it. And that's what trauma does. It leaves you in that home, it leaves you in that space. If you're in a neighborhood, where every day there's a shooting, you can feel like this is a space where you can't escape.
You can't address the sliver of the individual trauma that people face without looking at the large picture of like how this is designed. Because that one individual will multiply that by thousands and thousands and thousands.
On TV, you see mainly other races on the couch talking to a psychiatrist or a counselor. You don't really see us, so it's like, I don't think this is something I'm supposed to do. I've never seen my mom or my dad do it, so am I supposed to do this too? But it's like a greater sense that it's like, no, just go and get help.
You start to learn you and how you respond. And if you can't get back to joy in a decent amount
And also, I think it's really important to be able to share your story because there are a lot of people in the world who like go through so many things, but there's just like, no one looks like me, no one understands, no one gets me. But it's like, there are people who understand, there are people who get you and who are going through the same things.
Like I know how every day, but it's something in my heart. Like me being connected to him and like reaching out, like it just heals me. I let them tell their story. I validated.
Family, whether it's a grandparent, whether it's the woman down the street, whether it's the uncle at the rec center, the community piece that steps in and says, like, you know what, I'm going to watch out for this, I'm going to look out for this.
I feel the education about trauma is so important. Being educated about trauma will help you.
I spent the large part of my life living in a hyper masculine phase that I thought was okay. So I did the fighting in middle school, did drama schools and stuff like that. So that's when I kind of found sports, and that's when I started to try to move away from that behavior and being an individual.
You know, me working out, and I also like to draw.
I joined the boxing team, learned how to start boxing.
Music has always been my sort of go-to.
Running takes away, like, it takes me out of the world.
And so I do a lot of visual writing.
I meditate. You don't hear about that often, and not from no black male. I inhaled it, and then I breathed out.
For me, drumming was definitely like my escape. You don't have to be subjected to what you see outside. You know, speaking as like negativity, that you know, you can always be positive. My smile should make you smile.
So thank you all for your attention and listening and for your continued commitment to healing. It is a different story, and it takes a little bit of time to get it to kind of understand it. It took me a long time to really hear this and to understand that there is hope for healing if we can create the kinds of conditions that where young people feel supported, where providers feel supported to understand their own vulnerability in this space and to engage with survivors in their full humanity. We're seeing changes in how medical students engage. Some of these young people here are medical students now and residents. And one of them is actually, this is in Philly, one of them is coming to Chicago to Rush to train. So thanks for allowing me to be here and have this conversation with you. I'll send along links to these videos if you'd like to, because I know sometimes it's hard to hear everything that's happening. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. And are there any more questions? There are questions.
Well, you present trauma, I think, quite accurately as a real change in the way in which the brain functions, but you offer cognitive processing theory as a way of sort of, I assume, reprogramming the brain. What is it about cognitive processing theory that really can have this immense impact upon brain functioning?
Yeah, I think that it's a really good question, and I think what we engage people in is a real acknowledgement that the world has changed in a very significant way for them, and allows them, through telling their story, to kind of reshape that. So there is a method called prolonged exposure, which is built on the idea, it's somewhat the idea of resolving a phobia, that revisiting the event in the safety of a therapist's office can help to, in a sense, rewire. I don't like to use that word because that sort of sounds more mechanical, but helps people make sense of this. And it may reduce their symptoms, but it also may allow people to say, the symptoms don't bother me as much. And so we do know that naturally, over time, for some people, their symptoms resolve, even if they have PTSD. And so I think the way we think about it is, you're on that natural journey of your symptoms coming down. How do we help you make sense of that so that it doesn't translate into behaviors that are harmful to you? I wish we knew more at the neurochemical level about what was happening, but maybe in the future.
I'm curious. I know that you're at Rush and you get your fair share of trauma victims, but is there a similar program at Cook County who probably gets even more than you do?
That's a really interesting question. Rush is not a level 1 trauma center, so we see very few people who have had a firearm injury. What we're doing is to screen anyone who comes in for exposure. So it's a little bit different model. The program that we founded in Philadelphia, Healing Hurt People, we came to Chicago in maybe, I can tell you exactly when it was, in 2013 to talk about it. We met a psychologist named Brad Stolbach. He replicated Healing Hurt People at Stroger, and that program has been in place more than 10 years and is twice as large as the program in Philadelphia. So yes, there are programs now at Stroger, at the U Chicago Trauma Center, at Advocate Christ. And so this is a movement that has exploded. I'm really glad you asked this question, across the country. So now there's a national organization that supports this. But many hospitals don't have it. Many trauma centers don't have it. It's only recently in Illinois eligible for some form of reimbursement under a Medicaid waiver. It's an 1115 waiver. It's still working its way out, but hopefully that will make it so that we can see more of these. Yes.
What's always bothered me about this is I have never understood the reason kids shoot other kids. What is the motivation? What is the feeling after somebody shoots somebody? Is it, I'm now the big guy on the block, everybody will be afraid of me? Or don't those people have traumatic issues about shooting somebody or not?
So an important point is that, and we know this from studies of people who have been in combat, that people who are responsible for violence against others often do suffer post-traumatic stress as well. But I want to take you back to that question, and I want to try and do it in the context of trauma. We often hear stories on the news that a young person got on a bus, somebody was looking at them, or they stepped on somebody's foot, and then a violent act occurred. And we often think, that's so crazy, that's senseless, it makes no sense. Well, you remember that cartoon of the brain. So let's say, for instance, you've had an experience where someone shot you. And before they shot you, they locked eyes with you. Okay? Now, you were injured. That was part of what happened in that setting. When you get on the bus and someone locks eyes with you, what happens in your brain is that you're transported back to the time that you were shot. So that locking eyes feels like a life-threatening moment. It can be hard to imagine, but as you talk with people with post-traumatic stress, you'll realize how vivid these experiences can be. Now, it's still a leap to how that gets to violence. Much of the time it doesn't. But it is the brain's message to people in those, often in settings, that even what appears to be a benign stimulus is actually life-threatening. Now, that is not excusing it, but it is explaining it. So it takes us back to maybe, if I understand PTSD, maybe I can understand that reaction, and I can think about ways to deal with this. Like, how do you manage this? If you know that this is going to happen, if you know that this is possible, then you can take alternatives. You can get off the bus. You can ask somebody else for help. You can use a grounding tool, so something like a coin, anything that brings you back. And those are techniques that are well known. So I hope that helps. Sometimes, so I try and think when I hear something that happens, and it's disturbing, I try and think, well, what is it that was happening in the individual, and how might we think about that differently? It's hard, though.
I'm a child psychiatrist, so I made my living on this.
Okay.
And I want to comment that still the most common cause of PTSD is rape, sexual abuse, rape, and often unreported, underreported, and so forth. But, you know, on a kind of a hopeful message, I think what's going on in the research world with PTSD is very promising. And I'm going to use this word, and it's going to drive somebody of you nuts. It's the use of psychedelics. And I'm sure at Rush you talk a lot about that. And it's very promising, and it offers rather quick results. So just my comments.
I appreciate that, because new ways of thinking about this and making sure that access, right, so that we can create safe places where people who have been victims of sexual violence feel as though they'll be validated, and then we'll have something that's helpful. That's brilliant. Thank you for offering that.
How about the family members of someone who's been shot? The victim, I understand, you talk to the victim, you get him in the hospital, you can do a profile of them, but what about their family members, or what about people who were involved in, let's say, a school shooting? Not the person who was actually shot, but the people around that person. You know, is there something that might be outside your boundaries, but is there something being done for those things?
It's a really important point. We know that vicarious trauma, witnessing violence, is responsible for probably a greater amount of PTSD than actual direct violence. So when studies that looked in the aftermath of 9/11 found that many people who actually hadn't been in direct contact with any of the horrible views of the actual site had PTSD, people who were on the other side of the river and the like. In the hospital setting, it is usual that people come with families, or that families flock there as they should. And so the community health workers that we have are always positioned in the emergency department to help families through that moment. That moment when people are the most upset and fearful is the moment sometimes when retaliatory plans are set, or someone's like, I'm going to go take care of this myself. And so taking a place to keep people, to the extent possible, to help people take a breath, make sure they're safe, help orient them to what's happening, so that so they understand something's happening in their bodies as a result of a very normal process. How do we hold them in that space? So that is part of what we do. And I think that is built into this program of reimbursing hospitals, is to have folks who are there to serve the families.
Is your program federally funded, and are you in danger of losing those funds?
You ask a really good question. There are programs some of the programs across the country were federally funded, either through Department of Justice funds or HHS. We are not. We're funded philanthropically. And so we're able to deliver these services without any charge. But it is a problem. The administration has eliminated most of the CDC's injury center. So they laid off 120 people in that unit. And they've constrained it, they've shrunk it significantly. And we were talking with somebody this morning about that who works there. It's really dispiriting for the folks there. So how we rebuild that is going to be a challenge. I hope that philanthropy is stepping up. The MacArthur Foundation, for example, I don't know if you've heard John Palfrey talk about set it at 6. So they're increasing the amount. Usually they have to meet a minimum amount of their revenue, the amount of their endowment going out. They're increasing it, and they're encouraging other foundations to do that. It may not fill the gap, but it will continue to fuel, we hope, those programs that are doing good.
Yeah, a lot of this talked as if the trauma has occurred by a single incident, and so once that goes on, then you get a person to recalibrate his life. But in many senses, they're in an environment where that doesn't go away. The environment continues to be there with bullets flying, and maybe it wasn't your brother who was killed. Maybe it was the guy you used to play basketball with. So how do we deal with the fact that you're going to remove trauma, which I completely agree with you, by the way, and get to the point of, where somebody's actually on a positive track that won't be distracted by the next time an incident comes up? How do you, or maybe you can't deal with that. Maybe you just keep trying.
Well, I think that it's a really good question. Increasingly, and my colleague could speak to this potentially, is we're talking about complex PTSD, which is really people who have experienced multiple recurrent trauma and the ways in which that plays out in their bodies as well as in their emotions. But if we come back to this idea that the experience of trauma is one when your internal resources and your external resources are insufficient to deal with this external threat, the goal would be to build those resources, to build resilience against trauma in the future. So creating supportive community around people who are subject to trauma, sometimes through groups. We find it's really powerful to have young people engaging with one another and making sense, not just retelling traumatic stories, but having a kind of container for how they talk about safety and managing their emotions and encouraging one another to think about this experience from someone who's actually been through it. And so if we can build support around people and help them build their internal capacity by having ways to diffuse or de-escalate in their own bodies, we leave them in a better position to experience what we may not be able to prevent, that is exposure to trauma in the community. But by rebuilding and having them be emissaries for others, we begin to address what we think about as community trauma. It's a long-term need, but I think it's showing results in many places.
Well, thank you all for all your great questions. And John, we can't thank you enough for being here tonight. This was really terrific.